Our economy is fueled by dynamic workplaces where the impossible becomes possible, where individuals reach their full potential. SHRM impacts the lives of 115 million workers and their families every day. And together, we can build a world of work that works for all. That is our vision: to advocate for better policies, elevate human resources, and develop stronger managers. Still, the workplace needs work. By creating better workplaces, we are truly creating a better world.
Hello and welcome to the first ever Better Workplaces Challenge Cup. I'm Guillermo Correa, Managing Director of SHRM Labs, SHRM's Workplace Innovation Lab and Venture Capital Arm. Thank you for joining us as we kick off the regional finals with the Northeast finalists. A special thanks to New York City SHRM and Pittsburgh HRA, who co-hosted local rounds in the Northeast region. So given the state of our workplaces in our world today, this year's competition is very timely. Remote work, the return of the skills shortage, and the urgent need to reskill for post-pandemic business realities are driving the workplace to new heights of innovation. And innovation is the key reason why SHRM launched this competition. So the Better Workplaces Challenge Cup is a pitch competition to find the latest innovators that are solving the most critical workplace challenges. Before you hear from an incredible group of startups and their solutions to these challenges, you will hear from three great future of work thought leaders. We've put together a great lineup from which you will gain insights into how you can reimagine your strategies, processes, and policies. As you listen to the presentations, if you have any questions, please submit them through the chat function and we will cover them at the end of each presentation. Please note that this event qualifies for 3 PDCs towards your SHRM CP or SCP certification. We will provide the code at the end of the event. And now, please help me in welcoming to the stage our first presenter, Star Carter, co-founder, chief operating officer, and general counsel at Kanarys. Welcome to the stage, Star, and it's all yours.
Awesome. Let me share my presentation with you all. Give me 1 second. Okay. Hopefully you all can see my screen. Here we go. Let me jump right in. I'm going to put it in share presentation. Okay, there we go. Let's jump right in. So thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction, Guillermo. Today I'm going to talk to you all about specific top trends. We're talking about future of work, and I'm going to put the overlay and the context in with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, focusing on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion data. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about how DE data can inform your talent acquisition and your retention strategies specifically. So this is a picture of my co-founder and CEO. I am a co-founder and COO, Mandy. And I only bring this up because that's what we do at Kanarys. We bring data to the front and center. And that's the reason why today our presentation is focusing on this diversity, equity, and inclusion data specifically. So here's what we're going to talk about today, some top trends specifically with respect to DEI data. This is either in place now or it is coming your way. So it's very important to be on top of these trends and understand how they can affect you and what you do in your everyday work life. So we're going to talk quickly about regulatory reporting, some things that are in the pipeline and are currently here, key performance indicators, also known as KPIs with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, and then a little bit about how this DEI data can affect your employer brand at your company. And that specifically affects your talent acquisition and your talent retention. So some DEI data disclosure requirements. The SEC is getting in on this, the Securities Exchange Commission. There have been some recent amendments that now require companies to make disclosures around human capital management, HCM. And this is on an annual basis starting this year in 2021. These requirements specifically include descriptions of your human capital resources, your people management resources, not only quantitative HCM information, but also qualitative information around HCM. And then specifically diversity policies and measures that correspond to a company's objectives. And it has been insinuated that this will continue to focus on pay equity, opportunity equity, as well as representation at the board level and at management levels. Just with a lot of things with the SEC, there's rules that come down and people are a little bit confused about what exactly those disclosures are. So we're going to see, as this gets implemented now, more guidance from the SEC on exactly what this disclosure requirements will mean once it gets put into practice. But these are in place now from the SEC specifically. It's not only governmental agencies focused on this disclosure requirements as well. We're looking at some private companies making specific requirements, and Goldman Sachs is another really good example. There are specific diversity requirements from Goldman Sachs, big investment bank, mammoth investment bank, and they have said specifically they are not going to help private companies go public in an initial public offering, IPO, unless that company has a diverse board. And how does Goldman Sachs define that in their rule? At least 2 board members have to be from a chronically underrepresented group. And they define that for this role for Goldman Sachs as gender identity, sexual orientation, race, or ethnicity. NASDAQ. Most of y'all, I think, are familiar with NASDAQ. This is a public exchange for companies that get listed, and they've recently changed their requirements around board diversity. They now require all listed companies to publicly disclose diversity statistics that are transparent, and consistent. I wanted to make sure I got those adjectives right regarding their board of directors. And not only that, they require most of their listed companies to have, and by the way, if you don't have, you have to explain why you do not have at least 2 diverse directors. Again, we're seeing the director level being a focus here. How does NASDAQ define diverse? One of the directors need to self-identify as female, and at least one has to self-identify as either an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ+. We then get to California. So a little bit of background on here. Under the Obama administration, there was a new rule set to the reporting of EEO1s. So right now, if you're a company and you're over 100, you have to report to the federal government your ethnicities, your genders across the employee workforce, and the numbers under each of those categories. Under the Obama administration, there was an additional requirement. It's called Component 2. And not only do you have to report what I just stated, but also specific pay data across those demographics. Under the Trump administration, that was halted in 2017. There has been speculation that under the Biden administration, that pay data requirements will come back up. But in the meantime, California has adopted a new pay data reporting law that is very similar to that federal law Component 2 that Obama had implemented that got halted. And so under California, if you're a covered employer, you have to submit this first set of pay data reporting data to the state by March 31st. So the first due date has already passed, end of Q1. And by the way, this new law applies to not just companies that are headquartered or have a strong presence in California. If you have at least one employee that is located in California, you are on the hook as a private California employer to report this information if you have more than 100 employees. And with the remote setup now, it's fairly likely you might have one employee in California and you're on the hook for this reporting requirement. And under this reporting requirement for California, you have to do the same things, race, ethnicity, and sex under 10 specific job categories and report those numbers. But the additional amounts that you have to also include are the number of employees specified by pay bands for each of these employees in these categories, as well as the total number of hours worked by each of these employees, which is inclusive of paid time off. So to dig a little bit, we covered regulatory requirements that are in the pipeline or possibly coming down the pipeline and coming your way. We're also seeing trends with respect to these key performance indicators in the DEI realm. And some of these trends include, with private and public companies, making sure there is a performance monitoring system, evaluation, objectives, that are set forth for every employee, no matter what level. So making sure employees understand where they are and they're being judged by objective criteria. Also holding leadership accountable. Now we're seeing a lot more companies say, you know what, diversity and inclusion is a business imperative, and we are going to tie promotions, we're going to tie bonuses, we're going to tie actual money for specific leadership to make sure that they are hitting these DEI KPIs specifically. And there has been a focus on cultural competencies. Let's establish cultural competencies across the organization, across leadership specifically, that have become very key to make sure that leadership understands cultural competencies and are able to implement that from day to day through their people management. So how does this DEI data, we talked about some of these regulatory requirements, some of these KPIs, how does this data affect your employer brand specifically? It's really important to understand how prospective employees are looking at your brand. And we're seeing a trend among specific generations about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, or here in this specific study, they call it diversity and inclusion. Gen Zers, your youngest generation, you're looking at 76% of them say that they feel like diversity and inclusion is an important topic for addressing within the brand. And you'll see that as you get older, those percentages drop. So millennials, 72%. Gen Xers, right above millennials, 63% say this. And baby boomers, 46%. So we're seeing a changing attitude among generations about D&I. And candidates, by the way, if you're going to try to attract those younger generations, they're increasingly expecting more information around DEI, transparency, what's good for them. In specific, some of these big companies will disclose to prospective employees median pay gap data. Citigroup, MasterCard, Starbucks, Adobe, and BNY Mellon. And on the talent retention side, it's becoming increasingly more important to give your employees a reason to stay. A reason to feel like they're loyal and to feel like they're being seen and can bring their authentic selves to work. So one of the most important things in order to match with that is understanding the intersectionality of your employee workforce. How do you do that? Well, a lot of companies track gender, they track race, at least in countries where you're permitted to do so. Europe makes that a little bit harder. But launch self-ID campaigns, have an understanding of the census of your workforce, not only with race and gender, but other things like disability, LGBT, military status, parenthood, things like that. So you can actually strategize and have a cohesive DEI strategy and implement solutions that are good for your entire workforce and not just make guesses. We see a lot of companies say, we're doing something for women. And we say, just because it might be good for women doesn't mean it's good for all women. It might be very different application to your women of color, for instance. So really paying attention to intersectionality and how they overlay is extremely, extremely important. So last, because I know this is short and sweet, but I hope you have some takeaways here, understanding the importance of DEI data and the trends. But progress is not perfection. We tell our company partners, it's okay if you're not perfect. What are you doing now, though, to implement in order to improve? So demonstrate that willingness and progress to changing systems. And I'm going to add intentionality on there. Be intentional about what you do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And last, if you don't measure, which is why we focus this presentation on DEI data, you can't change what you don't measure. So make sure you measure DEI data specifically and be very focused on that DEI data and implementing strategies related, putting that data front and center. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and come back on stage.
Excellent. Great presentation, Star. Really appreciate all the information around DEI, and it's certainly, becoming it's becoming a hotter and hotter topic for sure, especially because of what happened last year. DEI is clearly nuanced and difficult work, right? Where do you think it makes sense for an organization to start? Because I think that, and based on my experience of being here at SHRM for all these years, That's been one of the key questions that I've heard at our inclusion conference, for example, that people just don't know where to start and what steps to take afterwards.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree. Great question. It's super important, I think, to start with understanding leadership, making sure all leadership is on the same page. We definitely have dealt with companies where leadership is mixed on their approach to DEI and whether or not it's a business imperative. So as a leader in an organization, I would definitely start with making sure your executives, your leadership are all on the same page, because that's how you really push DEI down into an organization. I think next, it's so important to understand the perception of your employees. So make sure you ask them those questions, you assess them and their perception of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's where you start. That's a starting base to collect data and analysis and start implementing strategy based on what you're seeing in that data and analytics. And I think from there, you can identify areas of opportunity. And this is all difficult. You can't just start and have something overnight. But I want to encourage folks, especially leaders within organizations, to get educated. There are good resources, Googling stuff around DEI and get educated around diversity, equity, and inclusion, so you have some basic vocabulary to start with. And if you don't know where to start, bring in an expert. Not everybody is an expert in DEI, and not all companies have resources to go hire a chief diversity officer. You might get tapped as an HR professional, right, to do some DEI. So start with doing some own research and getting educated before beginning the journey.
Excellent. Fantastic. A follow-up question in regards to what you mentioned about the how the change from generation to generation, right? And how the percentage of people who are interested in DEI is just going up depending on how younger the generation is.
Absolutely.
Anything else you can elaborate about that?
Yeah, I think for that specifically, I mean, and there's been several studies about this, how we're seeing increasing care about DEI as the generations get younger. Where I want to, I think, makes sense to elaborate is that as generations get younger, especially for companies, some companies have a strategy where they more or higher experienced people. Others go straight out of college. So if you're going for those younger generations, it's so important to set yourself up as an employer of choice, as a company who is very interested in DEI. And how do you do that? It's making sure you have a very comprehensive DEI strategy. And then when you implement your hiring processes and procedures, those are supporting that DEI strategy. So there is a direct connect between understanding that the younger generations care about DEI and then creating your DEI story as a brand in order to connect with those younger generations.
Fantastic. And one final question, and it's something that came in through our chat here. How would you include data for people who don't want to be identified by gender or race? Yeah,
great question. So when we do all that's voluntary, right? It's voluntary. You can't force people to say this. What's important, whether you're going through Kanarys or another assessment company or someone else, is having your employees understand the why and having them understand that the data is truly anonymous, right? I think when we're working with companies, we want to make sure that employees understand the why, because it's the why that really moves people. And without people submitting self-identification language around their race or around their age or whatever demographic, fill in the blank, it's really hard to understand what that demographic's lived experience is. And so my advice there is to really work on the why, to encourage people to understand that their responses are truly anonymous, and that there is going to be movement and action put into place based on the answers you get from your employees.
Okay, fantastic. Excellent. Thank you so much, Star. We really appreciate you being here, and those were some wonderful insights that you had. So thank you very much for being here.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
All right. Excellent. All right, folks. Next, please.